Hello, James, and hello, Nisha.
Hi,
Good
Prue.
to be with you, Prue.
And hello to those online. I think we have people slowly joining this webinar, this discussion, really. So for those that don't know me, my name is Prue Gordon. I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. And I think for most of you joining us this afternoon, you will have been part of, or at least seen, the LinkedIn discussion between James, Nisha, and initiated by me on an article written by Kurt Campbell and Rush Doshi in the May edition of Foreign Affairs. So this webinar is all about discussing the ideas in that article written by these two, and I guess nutting through some of the premises that underpin the article, but also the implications of what they're suggesting, and I guess the extent to which they're based in international alliances today. And I think we'll also base the discussion, or at least draw the discussion, into looking at what is currently happening in the United States with the Trump administration, which of course is causing so much turmoil and chaos in international markets, but in international relations generally. So welcome. Again, welcome, James. Welcome, Nisha. Thanks so much for agreeing to bring your discussion online so other people can share. I should also say we are recording this, so it will be available after the webinar. And we really encourage people to put their questions in the Q&A. So the way the webinar is going to run is I'm going to quickly outline some of the key arguments made in the Campbell-Doshi article, and then we're going to go to Nisha, who's going to give a quick 10-minute outline of his views of what they're presenting, and then we'll go to James, and then we'll open it up for questions. So let me start. So I guess there are, four key aspects to this article. The first one is that China presents a threat to the US's industrial, technical, military, and global primacy. And by implication, though this isn't stated in the article, the US's and other countries' sovereignty. The key factor determining the challenge China presents to the US is the scale, in terms of both its productive capability, but also just the size of its economy. And it's this scale that's enabling their challenge to US predominance. And one of their key arguments by Campbell and Doshi is that the only way the US is able to counter this growing challenge is to bring together a group of like-minded countries who can counter this scale. So the way, and I guess one of the most interesting aspects of this article for me was the way they said that like-minded countries would be able to build the scale that could counter China was by pooling their capabilities. So I'll quote from the article because that's probably the best way to get a sense of it. It says, to achieve scale, Washington must transform its alliance architecture from a collection of managed relationships to a platform for integrated and pooled capacity building across the military, economic, and technological domains. So with its allies, all must come together to pool their markets, including behind a shared tariff or regulatory wall erected against China. So they describe this as capacity-centered statecraft. Now, on one level, the likelihood, this is quite a different envisaging of traditional alliances and traditional international relations, going beyond anything we've really seen before. So some might say this is really unrealistic. But that said, Kurt Campbell was a very senior member of the Obama as well as the Biden administrations, and has been a really leading force in a lot of the initiatives that Australia and other countries have been involved in, including things like the critical minerals, MOUs signed between countries, the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, which really were not your traditional kinds of alliance kinds of initiatives. So he's a serious player. He's no lightweight in Washington at all. So for him to be putting forward this argument and envisaging international relationships in quite a new way, I think deserves some decent discussion and working through, well, what does actually this mean in terms of possible options for future international relations, but also what does it say about what the thinking is in the United States. So we had this initial to and fro on LinkedIn, and LinkedIn is great, but quite limited in terms of its capacity to have a decent discussion. So, and James and Nisha had very, I think, differing views on the value of the arguments put forward. So we've given you this opportunity to have your say and share with each other and with people in the audience what you think. So we thought we'd start with you, Nisha.
Okay, Prue, thank you very much. And many thanks for actually setting this up and giving us an opportunity to have this really important conversation. So this paper is about the world economy, not just America. It's also about America's partners. It's also about America's enemies or those who it's contesting with. And it's also about changing circumstances that impact every economy. So I think to really understand this paper, I want to put it in a little bit of context as to why should Australia and other countries care about economic security and what might their relationship be to the United States and this type of plan. I'll bring that in a bit later. So just a good starting point, the Independent Security Intelligence Review of 2024 said there was 3 profound shifts since the last review. And these shifts are the heating up of geopolitical competition, the emergence of economic security as a policy paradigm and a policy challenge, and technology shifts, right? And so if you think if economic security has emerged as something profound, then we have to think, can traditional trade policy deal with that? My argument would be it cannot. But I'll look at some of the historical trends that brought us to this point. So we have to think about what has changed between 1991 and 2016, because we had 3 decades after the dissolution of the USSR of the entire global economy becoming integrated, very much facilitated by the World Trade Organization, regional trade agreements, and the great work of trade diplomats. Really beneficial to all economies, I would argue. The data is there. There has been some regional issues for localized economies, of course, from offshoring, etc. Very beneficial for Australia, small, open or medium-sized open economy, very pro-trade, and rightly so. So what happens with interdependence is you create dependence. And that's great if you've got geopolitical peace and you're not concerned about how that dependence can be utilized in ways that are bad for your national interest, your economic interest. So 2016 was a breakout point whereby there was a sense that this dependence was becoming a risk and a vulnerability. And this is not just the United States story, but as the preeminent geopolitical hegemon, it's a very big story for them in particular. So 2010, I think, is a nice breakpoint where economic coercion starts to come on the scene. There's a export controls placed on Japan over 2010 to 2012 on critical minerals, which a single country dominated in this processing. That was China. Consumer sanctions were placed on countries such as Norway, the Philippines, South Korea, Canada, Australia, Lithuania, for a wide array of different things that were non-economic. They're political, right, between those countries and China. So you're starting to already see a breakdown of the rules-based trade because non-economic matters are now being dealt with economically. So this is raising the economic security risk profile for all countries, right? We should also bring in non-Chinese actions, right? Because it's not just the China story as well using the economy. Russia weaponized gas very severely in 2022 against the EU, right? Trying to forestall EU action on the Ukraine after it invaded. US technology controls, containment, right? From China's perspective, this was containment, is containment since 2016. These have gotten stricter. Jake Sullivan, the high fence, small yard concept of keeping a continuous major gap in its technology lead, again for geopolitical reasons. In other areas, Japan and South Korea 2019 to 2023, Japan refused to export important chemicals for making semiconductors after there was a flare-up in their political relationship due to wartime reparations. So again, this is all heightened why economic security is in the intelligence review, why the government is saying we're in a new paradigm, and why countries everywhere are developing responses and reactions. On bringing it into the more of what they're talking about in the Campbell and Doshi paper, manufacturing again, have countries utilized manufacturing share strategically, right? So if you have a rules-based system and it's just commercial enterprises going out getting market share through fair competition, countries won't have a problem. If countries feel that state-owned enterprises are being utilized for state activities, and that's again a big issue for China, that EU, US, and Japan have long been concerned about very large subsidies. The OECD, in its most recent paper, looked at this 15%. So that's the largest amount of subsidies, over 15% of firm revenues. That's all dominated by China in progressing its desire to control strategic manufacturing supply chains in electric vehicles, in critical minerals, in leading technology. So that's been a bugbear. And if that's been used to create a strategic disadvantage, then again, that becomes an economic security risk. So let's be honest, China is the world's manufacturing superpower. And if you're the United States and you think you may be in a military conflict at some point, which again, this is the concern for both parties, over Taiwan and other hot points, then that becomes a major issue. How do you, if one side of that relationship is using the state to command and control parts of the economy, it's not the private sector anymore, it's not a commercial logic, then you have an economic security reality where the state must intervene some way or another. So let's, economic security is a paradigm. I'll quote a couple of points on this. A nice paper from Mitchell in 2024 defines it as how the state decides to manage the risks and opportunities of global flows of resources in an interconnected and dangerous world. Benson et al. 24, economic security is, I quote, the ability to safeguard against deliberate attempts by foreign entities to disrupt the country's economy or coerce it. So I think there's been, beyond the two main countries we're looking at, there's been a lot of other countries experiencing economic security risks and vulnerabilities. And so I think it's a legitimate paradigm in the first place. That's one of the key points I want to make. Countries do and governments need to consider economic security, need to separate their essential economic security risks from other parts of their trading relationships that can be left be to the commercial sector. And I think a lot will be, right? But there's still those really crucial bits. So look, with that said, let me fold it back into the actual paper for Campbell and Doshi. Now, I would start by saying they're trying to elucidate the ideal plan for how this would work out. They know that in reality, it's going to be messy, right? Just as the WTO is a great organization, but it's a very messy compromise, right? But it's still achieved a lot, right? Same with the GATT, like decades of evolution. So nothing's going to come from that paper that's ideal, right? We know that because national interests don't perfectly overlap. They'll overlap in some places, not in others. Different trading relationships. There's going to be different compromises that have to be negotiated. And I think the Biden administration was already on this path, and I can touch on some examples. So what's the concern they lay out? So it's concern number one in manufacturing, Beijing overmatch, right? Quantity has a quality all of its own. China has 3 times the capacity in goods manufacturing than the US, 200 times the shipbuilding capacity, 30% of world trade versus 15%, or sorry, of goods manufacturing versus 15% for the US. And that trend is going to get bigger. The gap, it's predicted to be 40% versus 11% by 2030, right? And it goes on and gives loads of key data. So basically their argument, and so this is now where you have to go from economics to geopolitics. That's a geopolitical risk. You cannot be so outmatched economically in manufacturing as a great power. It may be okay for smaller countries to import all their steel, cement, their EVs, etc. A big country just will not accept that type of dependence, right? Going back to that earlier distinction I made. So that's understandable from a geopolitical register, why they cannot, that's untenable for the US. So then they move to the point that, okay, we have this problem. How do we solve it? We can't solve it on our own. So they go back to demographics, right? The population differences are all in China's favor, demographics and already the built-out infrastructure, right? China is at the center of world manufacturing. The US will never overmatch it again. Impossible. So they know they have to expand their manufacturing base and deal with some of these economic security risks through internal balancing, what they can do with their own economy, and external balancing, right, against China through this new concept of alliances. So their view of allies can't be just about military dependence anymore. We actually need support from US allies to do more on the economic front. So basically they're arguing for an ecosystem approach. And in one way, it's not that radical because we already have trade ecosystems through plurilateral agreements. We have regional free trade agreements. We have mega regional free trade agreements. And these block they block market access for those outside the club and they smoothen it out and open up market access for those inside the club. So ultimately, you can use very similar architecture and just fold it into a geopolitical lens and say, okay, who do we want outside for geopolitical reasons, rather than we'll let everyone in who's willing to do the same liberalization that we want within the bloc. Now, that's going to run afoul of WTO rules. If you're going to probably make those type of arrangements where you're not letting people in who are willing to meet the liberalization standards, and you're going to make that on a national security argument, but that won't actually meet the criteria that are very narrow, that are laid out in Article 21. I don't think that's going to stop countries doing what they feel they need to do in their economic risks. So again, that's going to probably create more tensions with the WTO, but that's not front and center in this argument and for governments looking at these types of risks. So the group for balancing, I don't think they're assuming everyone and anyone's going to join in. They've mentioned a narrow few groups. A lot of them are traditional allies: Australia, Canada, Japan, Korea, Mexico, New Zealand, the United States, the European Union. A lot of cooperation already exists. It's a 60 trillion US economy. And so then you have the scale capability, Prue, that you mentioned earlier, to be able to overmatch or at least match. And again, also with those type of countries, it's not going to be a broad-based, there's going to be competing interests, right? So you think about Australia. Okay, so America might want Australia to cooperate on EVs, right? They don't produce many EVs in America. So where are you going to sell your lithium? It has to go to China currently. It's be against Australia's economic security to not do that. So unless you can start building and connecting user markets in these geopolitical free trade agreements, you're going to have a conflict of interest, that you're going to be asking partners to do things that's against their interests and is not actually going to solve anything. And I think in a way, the Inflation Reduction Act was trying to do that. Grow a domestic EV market so that you've got the end user, you've got the demand coming, that over time, Australian producers could start selling more into the US market, for example. And then if you're going to ask countries to decouple at the level of the US, I think that's just ludicrous. And it's not going to happen. It's not in their interest. So that's the Trump approach, right? And that seems to be what they're signaling. And I don't think they'll get much traction with that. The Biden approach was more messy. They're trying to build compromise in and try to understand where allies are willing to cooperate and where they won't. I'll just finish in with a couple of the initiatives the US was trying to set up. These are all mainly under Biden. Some of them precede that. So the Trade and Technology Council with the EU. Australia has long been classified as part of the National Technology Industrial Base to allow extra access to the US market. ITAR has always been a problem there. That's kind of supposed to have been resolved now for AUKUS. AUKUS, again, has many geo-economic and economic security aspects to it. The Inflation Reduction Act was also designed to allow more funding from the US over to Australian companies. Indian initiatives on critical and emerging technology. With Japan, they've coordinated on semiconductor export controls, and the Netherlands. So they've been able to get enough overlap of interest to get that in, to maintain a technology lead. The G7 has been working on economic security for some time, calling for group-wide supply chains, resilience, critical technologies. There's a lot of conversations happening. There's some institution building happening. There's a long way to go before you get anything close to what's happening with the in the paper, what they're calling for. But there's definitely appetite, and there's definitely a historical context that is motivating governments to find where these interests will overlap and how they can develop coherent economic security relationships. So I think I can leave it at that and look forward to the conversation thereafter.
Brilliant. So many questions, so much I want to say, but I'll hand over to James first. James, go for it.
Thanks, Nisha. Look, first point I just want to make. Clearly, you got Nisha and I on this webinar because we are coming at this from different perspectives, and we really are. That said, I don't see Nisha and I on extreme opposite ends of the spectrum, right? I mean, there was plenty he was saying there where I could quite happily nod my head along to. So let's just get that clear to start with. I also want to make it clear about where I'm coming from. So I don't have any problem agreeing that we are in a world of rising geopolitical risk and economic security challenges. No problem at all. And that includes risks stemming from China's industrial scale and its use of industrial subsidies. I agree. These risks need to be identified. Serious thought needs to be put into mitigations, including potential policy interventions. Economists like me, we don't just think that we should leave everything to the market, right? That is a myth. I taught an introductory microeconomics course for 10 years, and I guarantee you 2 weeks of that one semester course was homed in on the topic of market failure. We know that interventions might be justified. For example, when there's a difference in risk appetite between an individual firm and a community, that difference in perceptions could be over national security implications. So no problem whatsoever. If Campbell and Doshi were calling for specific interventions in, say, specific vulnerable supply chains, right? I would be on board with that proposal, but that is not what they are proposing. In my view, they are actually proposing a very radical departure. Nisha, you may disagree with that, but in my view, it's a radical departure from Australia's traditional trade policy approach, which has emphasised a non-discriminatory approach to trade. They are calling for countries like Australia to do an absolute U-turn and not just passively accept, but actively bring on a bifurcated regional and global economy. This would involve, in their words, quote, a defensive moat against Chinese exports, close quote. And Canberra would follow Washington in imposing, quote, coordinated tariffs on Chinese goods and coordinated non-tariff barriers, closed quote. All right, where to start? First of all, it is important that, in my view, it's important that countries like Australia are clear on what a good chunk of the motivation underpinning Campbell and Doshi's call is. It's right there in the first words of the first sentence. Here it goes. It starts off, success in great power competition requires, da 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 da. Note that it wasn't building resilient supply chains and enhancing economic security requires da 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 da. The US is engaged in great power competition with China. Australia is not. Australia certainly has an interest in constraining Chinese attempts at Chinese primacy and Chinese hegemony, but that doesn't follow that we have to line up 100% with the US. I mean, as Peter Varghese says, let me quote him here because I think it's a good piece. He says, the loss of US primacy may be regrettable, but it does not pose an existential threat to Australia. To assume it does is to handcuff ourselves to whatever the US decides to do to retain its primacy. Those strategies might make sense for the US, but they might not always be in Australia's national interests. I completely agree with Peter. Second point. For all the vulnerabilities in Australia's traditional trade approach, can we please also be clear on its strengths, including not just for prosperity, but for security too, and on the costs of switching and embracing a bifurcated regional and global trading order, with China sitting on the other side of the fence that Australia's on. The US trade to GDP ratio, its trade exposure, is just 25%. Australia's is double that. The US trade exposure to China is worth about 2% of GDP, of its GDP. It's worth 6 times that of Australia's GDP. If we lost our biggest export market, this is what's going to happen, I promise you. The Australian dollar is going to collapse, and that means overnight, the cost of Australia importing will skyrocket. And so the living standards of Australians will plummet. And as I said before, Australia's traditional approach was never just about making a buck. It was about resilience and security too. A non-discriminatory approach to trade provides Australian producers with maximum options. I mean, in 2020, I remember there were calls for Canberra to really drive friendshoring with the United States. Well, how's that looking now? In 2025, is the US our trade friend? I certainly don't think it is. I'm not criticizing those folks for not knowing the future, but what I do criticize them for is imagining that they could be confident about how the future would unfold. And I think it's unfolded in a way that if we had followed that policy approach back in 2020, goodness me, a bad situation we're in now would have been made even worse. Australia's Foreign Minister Penny Wong has made this point explicitly. She says that deepening economic integration with the region, including with China, is not just, and this is to quote her, not just an investment in our own prosperity, it's also an investment in our own security. She says stability and prosperity are mutually reinforcing. Even Peter Dutton, that well-known communist sympathizer and panda hugger, he said last year that he would love to see the trade relationship with China increase twofold. This bipartisan position in Australia is not some simplistic view that trade means you can't have conflict, right? Of course you can. Or that there are no risks from having trade exposures to China. But precisely how Australia and the rest of the region would be more stable, would be more secure if we joined the US in actively blocking or diverting trade away from Asia's biggest, by far, economy and most significant strategic actor is beyond me. I mean, how many other neighbours of Australia's neighbours do you see rushing to embrace this approach? None. Well, I think there might be some reasons for that. To take the same point a bit more micro, just because companies don't always factor in the full social and external costs of their actions, it doesn't mean they don't take geopolitical risk or supply chain vulnerability, supply chain resilience seriously. Or, and this is important, or that the government could do better. Dealing with risk, of which geopolitical risk is just one type, is business 101. If a business suddenly finds itself cut off from its main market or from its main supplier, first and most obviously, the biggest victim in that is the business itself. The idea that an academic like me or a bureaucrat sitting in Canberra is better placed to identify and assess and respond to risk a particular firm or even a particular sector faces, I mean, dear, oh dear. Third point, if you are convinced that Chinese economic strength does pose an existential threat to Australia, then maybe, just maybe, you might be willing to sign up to a radical change. But given the certain costs, surely you would want to have an exceptionally high level of confidence that the US were capable of undertaking high quality assessments and executing competent policy responses. I would suggest that nearly all the evidence points in precisely the opposite direction. Campbell and Doshi, for example, they lay a bulk of the blame for the shortfalls in US manufacturing and the trade deficit in manufactured goods with China on China's industrial subsidies and excess capacity, as they call it. Really? I mean, leave aside that US manufacturing output hasn't actually fallen. That's US economic data. That's not coming out of Beijing. If China has used trade distorting subsidies to get an unfair industrial boost, World Trade Organization rules allow countries to defend themselves. And indeed, the US is the world's most prolific user of those trade remedies. But take EVs, for example. I think this is really illuminating. Last year, the Biden administration, this is not the crazy Trump administration, right? This is the Biden administration, just slapped in place a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. The EU, in contrast, did a careful study and concluded that BYD, the leading Chinese EV manufacturer, deserved a tariff of just 18%, 100% versus 18%. How are the US and EU ever going to agree, even get close to agreeing on an appropriate tariff when the difference in starting points is so large? And the EU knows that the US isn't even trying to be competent in its trade policy design, let alone Australia, which doesn't even have a domestic car manufacturing industry. If China wants to sell cheap EVs in Australia, I imagine Canberra would be pretty thrilled about that. And also, why isn't the US taking policy actions that it is entirely entitled to do to boost its national competitiveness? For example, why isn't it spending more on fundamental research? There's no reason why it can't. Why hasn't it been for the last 20 years rolling out world-class infrastructure? There's no reason why it can't. Why isn't it producing science and tech and engineering graduates at a more rapid rate? There's nothing stopping it, but it hasn't. Prue, I promise you, I'm coming to a conclusion pretty soon. But let me just finish off by going a bit more macro. how does the US not run a large trade deficit in manufactured goods? How does it not? I have no idea. Successive Washington administrations have embraced a shift in the US economy towards services and away from manufacturing. The reason they did that was because services was where the high-paying jobs were. Second of all, the US has been running at more, the US economy has been running at more or less capacity for the last decade, right? The US unemployment rate for the last decade has been around 4%. And yet, despite that, Washington has been running crisis level budget positions. I mean, check this out. Last year, despite the economy operating at full steam and producing as much as it possibly could, Washington still jammed in. This is the Biden administration, jammed in fiscal stimulus to the tune of 6.5% of GDP. That's $1.8 trillion. That demand has to go somewhere. China only accounted for less than 1/4 of the US trade deficit last year. There was also Japan, there was also Mexico, there was also Canada, there was also Taiwan, there was also Korea. It's running large manufacturing trade deficits with everyone, and that's because there's no other way it possibly couldn't, given Washington's own policy positions. And finally, if you look at the reality and not the rhetoric, not the press release, not the joint ministerial meeting readout, or not even an MOU, but the reality, I just think all the evidence points to the fact that the US is not actually interested, primarily interested in friend-shored supply chains with countries like Australia. This may be hard for someone with a national security background to accept, because I understand that in the security realm, the US is a wonderful partner for Australia. I'm not calling for Australia to abandon the US alliance. But what these folks have to understand is that in the world of international commerce, more often than not, the US is one of our major competitors. Australia is great at agriculture. We're great at mining. We're great at education. Well, guess what? So is the US. And you see that in all sorts of data. I mean, it wasn't for nothing that when Australia lost access to the Chinese market for a whole bunch of goods in 2020, it was actually US firms that picked up the biggest share of our lost sales. As Naoise said, there's a simple reason why 98% of our lithium goes to China. It's because the US doesn't want it. And it won't want it in the future either. Do you know why? Because the US is subsidizing the construction of lithium mines in Nevada. So they're a competitor, not a partner in the economic realm. Prue, I'll stop there. Thanks for your patience. And I'm sorry if that turned out to be a bit of a rant.
No, we love rants. Naoise, did you want to respond at all?
Yeah, no, look, I'd like to take up a few of those points. So again, I think there's quite a bit of middle ground where me and James have a fair agreement. And I think it's absolutely true that some sort of wholesale geopolitical barrier is going to be ramped up between the US and a number of other countries as that barrier to Chinese imports. That's a completely no-go, right? So there needs to be realism here, right? They're putting up an ideal case of what they think they want, and then they're going to negotiate. They understand that. They're policymakers. They know they have to start where you want to be, because you're going to end up negotiating something much further away, right? And traditional free trade agreements are a great way to understand that principle. That's what they want, an ideal. That's not what they're going to get. They're going to have to negotiate much more delimited areas where there's an overlap of interest. And furthermore, you would undermine your allies' economic security. And say in Australia's case, if you tried to do that, if you took 5 minutes to look at the economic data and the relationship between Australia and China, right? And these are comparable. These are economic laws of competitive advantages and meeting points between what each country has and what each country needs. But what we need to think about here really, right, in the regional sense, geopolitically, Australia is not in a great power competition. It does have an interest, though, in an offshore balancer, which is the US in this case, in maintaining a certain amount of strategic balance in the region. That's what Australia's interest is. That's been an important part of its interest in the US alliance. And historically, in all the regions, right, there's been offshore balancers that normally interact. We say in Europe, the UK was always an offshore balancer and basically sat on the side of whichever group was going to be overpowered by everyone else. So that's where the interest, there's obviously a strong interest in that. China's militarism in the region, its annexation of the South China Seas, it's throwing its weight around. Its military buildup is the biggest since 1945. What do countries want to do with military buildups? They want to use the military because they have plans, right? And it has designs in Taiwan. That has to be concerning, right? And that cannot be separated anymore from economic relationships, because your ability to secure your geopolitical interests are also integrated in an integrated global economy with your economic relationships. So it's not realistic to say that Australia can just have a geopolitical alliance with the US now, which, as James said, there's a strong interest in, and just pretend we're going to separate fully the economy, even though everyone agrees we're in a world where economic security is a real thing, right? But then, so the messy part is, what are you going to do about that, and what type of relationships are you going to build? The non-discriminatory approach has served countries well, but I think that's unrealistic in the strategic areas where private firms are facing a state-backed competitor. Right. So if you're in the critical minerals sector, what do they say? Most firms are actually unwilling to invest in the first place. China dominates the market, not Chinese firms, China, right? Because they're state-owned enterprises or they're state-backed enterprises. And in China, there's a power vertical, right? In a liberal democracy, we're used to separation of powers and the separation of the economy, the public from the private. Private actors go out and do their thing for commercial interest. In China, it's a power vertical. Everything is underneath the party. The party has not only the formal rules to allow this, it's outside the constitution. Read the constitution, that's made clear. It's not bound by the constitution, and it can intervene anywhere in the economy, whether it's a state-owned enterprise or not, and get that entity to act in the state's interest. That's what you're up against. So saying traditional commercial free-flowing trade is suitable in that, and that might be narrowly defined, but saying that's okay, I think that misses the geostrategic point there and the risks that involves. The critical minerals one is a really good one. It's in the news a lot at the moment because there's been more export controls. If you look at China's policies there, and they're well documented, they go right back to 1990. Rare earth elements were classified as protected and strategic minerals. Foreign firms were already excluded from mining at that point and could only get joint ventures subject to government approval. License regimes were tightened up in the following decade. SOEs got priority access. Then between 2000 and 2010, industry consolidation, state-owned enterprises maintain a monopsony over global supply, dump onto the market if there's a major competitor. Firms have reported this, and that's the big fear, right? Firms are even now getting up and running under government support in Australia. RF4 would be one project. Aluka in Yaba in Western Australia is another one. And there's a concern, right? They're trying to do offtake arrangements that are protected from this type of market dumping. But those companies are afraid to even get into strategic industries China has identified in Made in China 2025, different strategic industrial policies where you know you're facing the weight of the Chinese state behind those commercial firms and or state-owned enterprises. So you can't have traditional policy settings for there. That's not always an issue for Australia because it's not a manufacturing power, right? It's supporting that. But my point is that Australia cannot just pretend that the US is going to be okay for not to get some sort of support in the manufacturing element and not to have some sort of commitment if the alliance goes on. So that's the challenge for Canberra, is how to mediate between growing economic security alliance requests, right? Because you can say no, but can you say no to everything? I don't think so. And then negotiating then the trade relationship with China, which is very important. There's a bipartisan consensus again on that. You're absolutely right, James. And so that's the trick here. That's what you have to navigate, how to maintain relationships with Beijing, how to communicate though when you're being firm on your national interest. And governments have been doing that in Australia for a long time. They're doing the policies that they feel is in the national interest, and it's going to create friction, right, all the way along. And I think we're in a big renegotiation period with Washington. With the Trump, everything Trump 2.0 has done runs against what they're calling for there. It completely runs against it and is breaking trust significantly. That will be hard to build back. So where these type of policies go after from here under the Trump administration, nobody knows. They don't know their own policy from one day to the next. So I think that's an argument for a past administration. Will it be taken forward by a next administration? And can you have any kind of sense that anything done in the US has longevity now? Because even acts of Congress, which are meant to be outside of presidential control and authority, are being undermined, right? So I think that's the wider challenge for this plan, is that the current environment and what Washington is currently doing mitigates and undermines everything that Campbell and Doshi are arguing for and what they were involved with in the previous administration.
It's a good point. Since before President Trump, I think this kind of discussion would have been quite different. But as you say, what the measures he's introduced are completely contrary to the vision outlined in this particular article, in as much as he is destroying alliance relationships and really not creating an environment that would be conducive to this kind of cooperation at all. I think the two of you, I'm sold by both of your arguments, but I guess for me, I sort of want to look at the premise of the argument, particularly on that question of whether China actually does represent a threat to not only US sovereignty, but Australian sovereignty. And I would have said before Trump that it was both China's actions, which have been seen to try to impose on our sovereignty to some extent. So I'm thinking of the 14 points, the trade barriers imposed against Australia's exports to China. But that underlying that was this view that the values within the Australian system and the Australian community, things like democracy or free elections, free speech, freedom of association, that we shared with the US. And now I think with the Trump administration, such radical changes happening there, it's almost difficult to argue that we share common values with the United States. I can't believe I'm even saying that. It's just such a radical change from the US we used to know, or we thought we knew. So I'm not sure that even the vision, this pooling of capabilities and these like-minded forms of cooperation envisaged in the article, I see them forming without the US actually, and in response to Trump.
Yeah, if I could, if you don't, would you like to keep going, Pro? I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah. No, you go.
No. Naoise, I think you give the Campbell and Doshi article a very generous reading when you say, they're sort of presenting an ideal type, but of course they know, in reality, it's going to be a lot different. Don't forget the Biden administration, of which they were a part of, they had that, small yard, high fence. That was their strategy. This article is clearly a departure from that, right? They're not even trying to pretend to be small yard, high fence. They're deliberately using language that suggests it's far more expansive. The other thing, there's a couple other things I'd probably say is when we talk about our dependencies on China, I understand that we feel very vulnerable when it comes to rare earths, for example. Guess what? If you're sitting in Beijing, you're looking at the world and you're thinking, oh my God, we've got vulnerabilities everywhere. When it comes to China's energy security, when it comes to food security, all these sorts of areas, China also has its own dependency worries. So this is not a one-side issue. Given that, I don't see sort of both sides defaulting into a bifurcated world is actually our best strategy. And I really don't think we should exaggerate risks. Prue, you mentioned China's economic coercion to Australia against Australia in 2020. They had a good crack at us, right? They really had a good crack at us. They'd hit Philippine bananas before, Norwegian salmon, but with us it was, the list: barley, wine, lobster, copper, coal. Did we fold? No. It didn't cause Australia to change our political decisions, and moreover, it didn't really cost us much economically either. Why is that? For some very, very simple reasons. We are not dependent on China. We are mutually interdependent. China didn't hit the big ticket items. It didn't hit iron ore. It didn't hit lithium because they need Australia as a supplier. What about those other areas that it did hit? Well, in most of those areas, actually, those companies were readily able to mitigate the risks. When China said, we don't want your coal anymore, Australia, you know what our coal producers did? Okay. That's fine, because they sold those goods into open and competitive global markets. And so that means those markets overnight at low cost redirected Australia's output elsewhere. So look, I'm all for Nisha, you talked about specific critical mineral supply chains, right? So that's an example where I think you and I are actually not on opposite sides of the spectrum, right? If we're talking a specific rare earth where there's vulnerabilities, fine, let's have that conversation. But I just don't think Campbell and Doshi are talking about that at all. They're painting something, in my mind at least, something very, very different.
I just say one thing? So most of the industries in Australia that were hit by those Chinese tariffs were able to diversify, but even then the value of the return on the exports to other markets were lower in many cases, but also wine and lobsters those sectors in Australia took a major hit. But I think more importantly, China is actively looking for alternative sources of iron ore, and the action itself demonstrated it was very willing to use trade as a geostrategic tool to influence the decisions made domestically. So I don't think, even though open markets were able to buffer the impact of those barriers to some extent, when I was just a young diplomat, we were told economics and politics, we keep those separate, because everyone, as long as we're continuing to maintain open markets and trade, whatever happens politically, everyone benefits from that. It's not the case anymore. And China's actually, I think, most clearly demonstrated that they're very prepared to use trade and investment as a tool to achieve geopolitical ends.
Yeah, but Prue, when I sit here in Sydney and I talk to businesses, they know their vulnerability to geopolitical risk. They're the ones in the firing line. So if you're an Australian producer in an industry where you know you don't have a lot of options and you could well be in Beijing's crosshairs, you're aware of that. You talked about wine, for example. I agree, the wine industry was hit hard, but what alternative did they have? I mean, in the 4 years, that China had tariffs on Australian wine, US purchases of Australian wine actually fell. When it came to lobsters, I can tell you that China accounts for 90% of global rock lobster imports. So what are they? So yes, they had a large exposure to China, but it wasn't because they were naive to geopolitical risk. It was literally because they had no other choice. If the US wants to step up, and we want to do, of course we can encourage that with marketing and all that sort of stuff. But fundamentally, that's the business reality that Australian businesses are facing.
Yes, and
look, I'll just jump in on that one. Yeah, so the economic coercion one. Look, there's a couple of points here. First of all, we have to distinguish between what governments want and don't want, and businesses want and don't want, and the logics, right? Businesses are out for commercial gain, so businesses operate in high risk scenarios all the time, right? In emerging economies, developing economies, and war-torn countries, and they understand the risks, as James is saying, right? Maybe they're not always aware to certain risks, right? Because you're meant to have a rules-based trade relationship with China. You shouldn't expect to get that to have your industry wiped out if you're wine, right? Billion-dollar industry wiped out overnight. So let's remember heavy concentrated costs. But will they go back afterwards if they scan the world and Chinese are now with the sanctions are over? We'll buy your wine and there's no one else to buy. You'll sell. You take the risk and then you start using some profit to diversify. I agree. Businesses can handle that risk. At the governmental level, it's a different logic. You don't want to be bullied and pushed around by other governments, especially if you have an agreement with them. You will also face political pressure. Do something about this, protect us, etc. Right? And so it has internal political destabilization effects, right? That the coercion became a federal election issue. It was part of the campaign that each side was using. Labour drove a wedge in saying a coalition kind of caused this through bad rhetoric. I think that's a bit of victim blaming. Yeah, maybe the diplomacy wasn't the best. Doesn't justify the assault, right? Fair enough. So a market's diversified, well, that's great. But Australia got a trade black eye, to use an analogy, right? If someone gives you a black eye and you fight them off, doesn't mean you're okay with that, right? You still want to secure that issue. So we need to disaggregate between what governments need to do in that situation versus businesses. But I agree, ideas like a NATO for economic coercion, I don't think that's realistic either. First of all, coercion is quite random. It's hard to specify where it isn't going to happen. Sometimes it can be using formal techniques, WTO investigations. You have to wait and see, is there actually an issue? Maybe it's not coercion, maybe there was dumping, etc. I think it's very tricky, and I would favor in that instance leaving that to businesses, raise awareness, maybe support them when they need to diversify. I think it's the more specific things where economic actors are being used strategically by governments to capture technology, market share, forced transfer of IP, that kind of thing. That's more definable, and governments can intervene and manage those risks and are often better placed, or can provide capital, for example.
I should just say, if anyone wants to get a question, you better ask it now, because we'll just let rip here. So, if you want to ask now or forever hold your peace. One thing I would say, just looking at actually the idea that they've proposed for this pooling of capabilities, for me, it actually represents an open market that's just cutting out China. In every other way, supply chains that have existed between, for about the last, 30, 40 years, we do have pooling capabilities, which are based on these very diversely sourced supply chains that tap into the most efficient form of production in different markets. But what they're proposing is using the US as a platform, which in many respects, with the reserve currency role that they play, and in terms of being a big consumer market, they do already provide that platform, but at the moment it's for the world, pre-Trump. But what they're proposing is either that kind of open market and those pooling of capabilities through supply chains, just cutting China out, which I appreciate is a huge caveat. James is smiling. Or secondly, it's almost as if they're proposing going on. It's like a war footing. It's like countries who are fighting a war pooling their resources in a way to enable to counter an enemy.
Well, if that's their logic, Prue, if that's what they really have in their mind, then I think they owe it to every other country to say, look, this is where we're heading, this is why we're doing it, and then those other countries can decide whether that's in their interests or not. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That was all pre-Trump, though, I think.
Yeah, but look, sorry, no.
Yeah, no. So look, I thought a good conceptual distinction to bring this back a bit is the de-risking versus decoupling. And it seems that Trump again, he's a confused policy, but sometimes it seems to be hard decoupling. Now he's rowing back. The tariffs that went up to 145% and stackable, that's decoupling. The Biden administration and the EU have talked about de-risking. And there's multiple ways that's infinitely more realistic and manageable, and because you can then make those targeted interventions where government has specific capacities that the business sector does not have. Government has the responsibilities to deal with some of those issues and the backstopping capital, and can make the relationships. And everywhere else, you're kind of letting trade go as it is, as to the best of your ability. And that's what you're doing, you're de-risking. And there's another actually benefit to that, right? Why would you want to decouple all the trade when that keeps a sort of ballast in the relationship? Everyone should want to avoid conflict with whoever, any country. And so, and in China's case, if you've trade ballast, at least you've reasons to keep talking. If it's non-strategic trade, it can still be sizable. So it's important in an economic sense for whether it's soybean exporters in the Midwest, etc. And so I think that de-risking also keeps people having conversations and offers a natural kind of foreign diplomacy ballast that removes the tensions once the strategic elements are kind of carved out. And so that's what I favor as well, why I favor that de-risking idea as an overarching concept. And I think then countries are able to plug into that in a way that meets their needs much better. And all countries in this region have to balance between those two hegemons, right? They're the two main actors, and you have to try, and IPEF was a good example of that, an attempt to try. The US offers something economically without forcing countries to pick sides. I don't think it amounted to much in the end. It was often seemed like a talk shop, but they were trying to build something again, and that could have went somewhere eventually. But the market access wasn't there. So I think that's the other aspect that's important here, is that de-risking versus decoupling.
Yeah, can I just say something on this? I worry that we're just so focused on Trump. We think, oh, clearly Trump's crazy. We could all agree on that. But what about that Biden administration? I mean, they were pretty cool, weren't they? Maybe they might come back. I think we've got to have, yeah, I mean, look, the US domestic political system is clearly producing, on both sides of politics, trade policies that are not in Australia's interest. I mean, let's talk about the Biden administration. It continued to make the WTO completely dysfunctional. As you said, Nisha, the best it could offer was the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which, look, I'll give you my rant on that some other day, but let's just say it didn't embrace the CPTPP, right? Or the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which it could have, but it didn't. So I think that speaks to the domestic politics around trade in the US. The IRA is often cited, well, wasn't that good? Well, not really. Actually, not really. Because if you look at the way the detail of the IRA, it actually had the effect of sucking global capital, including from Australia, to the US. There was a whole bunch of subsidies for which Australian producers located in Australia were not actually eligible. They were locked out. I mean, I think of the Greenbushes lithium mine in WA. That Chinese shareholder only owns 26% of that company. A US company owns 49%. An Australian company owns 24%. But Washington said, no, that's not good enough. You're locked out. The Defence Production Act, people get very excited about that. The Biden administration added Australia as a domestic source. Well, look at that. Look how much they trust us. Read the fine print. What it says was Australia would only be considered a domestic source if US demand could not be met from North American sources, right? Also, if we can't get it domestically and we can't get it for Canada, sure, Australia, then we'll come to you. That was Campbell and Doshi, right? So let's not give the Biden administration or the Democratic side of politics a free pass on this stuff.
No, but how much do you think US policy, trade and economic policy over the last 10 years has been a direct reaction to China and trying to find ways of countering China? But at the same, I absolutely agree with you, James. They're looking externally for excuses for things that they should be fixing internally in terms of building up their own competitiveness and improving their own economy. So they're trying to blame China for a lot of things that they should have done domestically. But that said, I think there was, when China joined the WTO, there was a huge amount of goodwill and giving China the benefit of the doubt. And there was an implicit understanding that if China became a member of the global economy, they would liberalize and democratize. And there was those assumptions. Absolutely. Well, no, go for it. What do you think?
In Washington, there was a hope that China would democratize. That's got nothing to do with the WTO, right? If Jeff Raby's talked about this in Australian context, he was the former Australian ambassador to China, and he said, well, look, whatever Washington thought, whatever. But from Australia's perspective, welcoming China into the WTO was a pragmatic decision, right? It wasn't about ever imagining that China would become a liberal democracy just like us one day.
No, I guess I'm looking at how it was sold in the US and how they got congressional support for it in the US. A lot of the language is about this would be the first step towards China becoming more like us.
Well, true. I mean, yeah, okay, fine. But the US says a lot of things, and it seems to have this amazing capacity to see itself as a victim. And I could take US commentary seriously if they just focused on the areas where there were legitimate grievances on China. But all of the self-induced harm that the US has caused, they don't want to talk about that. They don't want to talk. I mean, a budget deficit, Peru, of 6.5% of GDP when your economy is running at capacity. Washington has complete control over that. You are going to get a massive trade deficit in manufactured goods if that's your own budget position, right?
No, I agree heaps. And then that's with most countries, when it's hard to do stuff domestically, they'll often look for blame for things internationally. That's sort of a stock standard political response.
Yeah, true. So just one point to react to. So James, those concerns about the IRA is sucking in capital, they were echoed also in the EU, right? For example, but everything you made a critique of US industrial policy, that's China's industrial policy turbocharged for the last 30 years, right? Massive subsidies, strategically focused on gaining world market share and getting ahead in every single technology through every method under the book that the state can facilitate. It's well documented in the research. And so that's a concern, not just for the US, that's a concern for Europe, for Japan, for South Korea. And so I think those issues, domestic industrial policy, that's why we try to kind of rule it out, right? And have that rules-based system. And this goes back to Keynes and after World War II. We know that those sustained structural imbalances cause problems. Where there are structural fiscal deficits, where there are a manufacturing share, right? China's going to 40% of world manufacturing share. One country, 40%, right? They're not 40% of the population, right? It's amazing. That's really concerning, right? The EU, they're pretty dovish, they're pretty reasonable, consensus-based organization. 2019, China is a systemic rival promoting alternative modes of governance, right? And they had a few cooperating partners as well. By 2024-25, it's like, no, systemic rival is our main framework for this. And Germany's really concerned, and they're losing market share. So I think that the strategic industrial policy, that's causing massive geopolitical issues for all the major economies, going back to China. And the WTO hasn't really proven itself able to manage that, unfortunately. Now, the US also seen issues with the appellate body making new rules that Congress didn't agree to. It's a constitutional issue, but the WTO hasn't been up to task of stopping China doing what it's doing. There's no restitution after the fact. If you lose all your industries and then a ruling is made and China stops subsidizing, it's too late, right? And so there's major errors in that. The WTO relies on countries actually having goodwill and good faith. China has implemented rulings, no doubt, but structurally its whole economy is nevertheless at odds, as Mark Wu's China Inc. paper lays out very beautifully, is structurally at odds with the WTO rules. It's a state-invested, state-led, state-directed economy with massive private sector activity as well.
I want to give you one more word, James, because we've run out of time.
Yeah.
Go for it.
No, look, I was just going to say, first of all, not all state subsidies are trade distorting, right? We've got to be clear on that. China's state has spent a whole lot of money that it is entirely entitled to, and the US could do the same, right? As I said before, education, R&D, infrastructure. If the US chooses not to do that to boost its national competitiveness, that's not on Beijing. To the extent that Beijing does engage in trade distorting subsidies, Nisha, you don't have to wait for a ruling. You can put in place a countervailing duty or an anti-dumping tariff straight away to protect your domestic industry. So the US actually has protections as well. Yeah, so look, I see we're over time. I might just stop there.
No, we've really just scratched the surface. These are the absolutely key issues facing policymakers in so many countries, including not just Australia, but also I think we haven't really touched on the implications of all of this with what Trump is currently doing and what thinking in the United States might be, but also what thinking in Beijing is. So we scratched the surface. You two are fantastic. I really love the fact that you bring quite different perspectives. I have to say, I think they're equally valid, which makes it really difficult for people to draw out, solid conclusions as to where to for countries and for policymakers. But thank you so much. No one got a question in, which doesn't surprise me whatsoever. There's just so much more to do. Please stay in touch with ACITI because we will really like to be hosting more of these kinds of conversations at this time and on these really important topics. James, Nisha, thank you so much.
Thanks, Prue. Thanks, James.
Thanks, Prue. Thanks, Nisha. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye-bye.